Fantasy football teaches you to evaluate results. NFL front offices evaluate decisions. Salary cap dynasty leagues punish you for confusing the two. In fantasy, we often ask questions like, did this player score points? Or did he help me win last year? But NFL teams are asking something very different. They're asking what decisions a contract allows, what decisions it prevents, and how fragile the roster becomes if things change. A great season does not always mean a good asset, and a talented player can still be a bad decision. Good contracts do not predict the future. They give you options when the future changes. On this show, when we talk about contracts, we're talking about both. The NFL contract tells you how secure the role really is. Your dynasty salary cap contract determines how much risk you're choosing to take on. Welcome to the Salary Cap Show, presented by Front Office Pros. Today, we're talking about how to evaluate your dynasty roster like an NFL front office. In dynasty fantasy football, you're always thinking about the future. Nobody's arguing that. Where things break down in salary cap leagues is when the projection itself becomes the plan. Joe, how do you think teams should better navigate that when they're thinking about when you incorporate a salary cap, it really does change the dynamics in a dynasty league. And I think people often forget that.
Yeah, I think that they definitely do. I mean, look, when you're trying to project, you're looking for what a player is going to be, what they're ultimately going to become. But the salary cap also adds another element to it, especially just you're looking at your overall salary cap space, how much the player is going to cost. Do you have the flexibility in the contracts to be able to maneuver and get out of it if you need to? Or are you tied up in a contract that you really just can't get out of and there's not really a margin of error for?
Well, yeah, and I think that margin of error honestly gets even bigger when you're thinking about the NFL contract, because that tells you how real their role is. If the team has dedicated a number of years to that player, okay, and maybe even a lot of guaranteed money. We're going to talk about this, but their role is secured. But your dynasty contract tells you how much room you have to be wrong. And I think that's been one of the things that I have really been burned by, because, it is funny because in our league, and I'll often share this openly, I'm the commissioner, so I share this openly with our other league mates, but I'll send them a text saying, hey, blueprint, when one of their players signs a contract extension with the team, because the team just gave you the blueprint. They just said, hey, we're going to give you a 3-year, 4-year deal, this amount of guaranteed. And, I tried to emulate my dynasty contract with real life so that if the team wants to get out, I can get out. Because I think if not, it's extremely risky to have, let's say you have a 5-year deal for a player who's a free agent. I mean, that's extremely risky.
Yeah. I mean, I always try to emulate the NFL contracts as well when I'm doing it. Sometimes the NFL contract and you matching that contract can also get very expensive and be a painful mistake. And, sometimes the NFL team makes a mistake and ultimately you end up paying the price as well.
So when we're thinking about NFL front offices and how they evaluate rosters, there are really 4 pillars that we think exist, and we're going to talk about them. And the first one is around the contract timeline. So when you think about that, you're talking about how many years remaining do they have in the contract? What's the guaranteed? So you have guaranteed money, so it's guaranteed base money, but you also have signing bonus. When the player signs a contract and they get signing bonus, the player, receives that in a big fat check. But from a salary cap perspective, it's, I'm trying to think of the word, but it is equally dispersed across the contract. So you got to, consider that as far as the guaranteed money and how much the team is tied up from a cap standpoint. And then what are the exit points? Once the guaranteed money is effectively gone, the team can choose to do maybe a post-June 1st cut. They could do just a regular cut. They can decide to trade. All those things matter. And when you think about, an NFL team, it's funny because I think as a Bills fan, people were losing their mind when Von Miller signed his 5-year, I think it was over $100 million contract. But it's whoa, slow down. If you look at the details here, it's not really that. It's effectively a 2 or 3-year deal for $55 million.
Yeah, for sure. And just point with the signing bonus that you got there, it might think you have some flexibility in terms of it does get spread out over the life of the contract until it kind of, if you want to trade that player and there's a lot of signing bonus, that becomes a problem because then ultimately you're on the hook for all that signing bonus. And sometimes the flexibility to trade players with signing bonus can be a little bit rough there.
Yeah, I think once we adopted signing bonus in our dynasty salary cap, we had an upheaval because we're like, "Are you serious? I really have to have all this dead cap?" But that's what happens, based on how the NFL operates. The dead cap accelerates forward, so you are on the hook right away, for that dead cap money, and you're seeing more and more. I don't know. I feel like I don't know. Maybe it was 2024. You'd have to correct me, but there was one year I feel like they were talking about void years all the time. I don't know if they're talking about it as much anymore. Maybe it was just a fad, but that's what teams are doing is they're literally taking that signing bonus and they're adding dummy years of the contract to make it so they can save money. That's where you see restructures all the time. They're going to restructure their base contract, bring the cap space way down so that they can then save money, go get free agents, re-sign their own, right? Go trade for somebody, and then they're going to add void years of the contract. They're going to have to pay the piper eventually. It's just that they're kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. I think the Saints are still kicking the can down the road and trying to get it out of all their cap gymnastics. But I think the void years really put it in perspective with the New England Patriots. I think they were one of the first teams to decide to go ahead and do that. And Bill Belichick starting the cap gymnastics. When they signed a couple of tight ends in that one off season, they used a lot of void years in their contracts. And people are like, man, how are the Patriots able to continue to sign all these guys? And then you take a look and they're adding out the void years. And like you said, they're those dummy years, but you can still spread the contract over those void years.
And that's one of the biggest, I would say, when you think about teams trying to save cap space, or I would say gain cap space is a better way of saying it, is restructuring is one of the main ways that they do it. And if they have a lot of dead cap and they have a lot of void years, it makes them less likely to want to cut or trade them because then all that dead cap accelerates, to that season and they're on the hook. It makes it a lot tougher.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely does make it a lot tougher.
I mean, the perfect example of this, and I still to this day don't understand it, is Deshaun Watson. The Browns are continually pushing the can down the road for Deshaun Watson. And obviously, Deshaun Watson's been a complete bust for the Browns. And you'd be like, well, why would they do that? The only thing I could possibly think is that because his contract is so unique that it's fully guaranteed, that they're basically like, well, we're going to have to pay him anyways. So we might as well kick the can down the road and try to become a more competitive football team because he's not even helping the roster. But I mean, like right now, his dead cap, factoring in the void years they've added, they have over 50 million in void years. That void year money. And if they were to cut him, he'd be 131 million dead cap. I mean, that is just outrageous. I mean, they're not going to be pulling. Russell Wilson was a record. The Browns aren't going to decide to dabble with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like the Broncos and the Russell Wilson situation was, it'll be interesting to see. I think, do we see something similar to that if the Miami Dolphins end up deciding to, get rid of Tua and move on from him at quarterback? They'd be eating a large amount of some dead cap space. I think that's, they'd be entering that Russell Wilson territory that the Broncos experienced, but yet Broncos are, back on top despite having to, continually eat up that dead cap and limit the salary cap that they do have to spend on the rest of their roster. And they've still been able to make the playoffs the last 2 years.
I could be wrong about this, but I honestly think a part of the reason why the Broncos were able to do it was because Sean Payton had enough cachet to be like, look, I don't care. We're doing this. And honestly, and I say this all the time, and Sean, no offense if you're listening to this, I think he could be arrogant. So I think he's like, you know what? I don't care how much dead cap it is. I know I can get out of this hole and I'm not worried about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you needed somebody like that at the same time, though, to convince the owners who gave George Payton the green light to give Russell Wilson that contract and also ultimately make that trade as well. I think it takes a confident coach like a Sean Payton to come in there and be like, look, we can eat this cap. I can still make this team competitive and, we'll be better moving forward. And so far he's proven that right.
Well, and then the second element that we feel like is a pillar for evaluating rosters is role security. Because when you think about role protection, some of the things that I think NFL front offices are considering is when it comes to the player. Is the role protected? Is this player easily going to be replaced? A lot of times you have a more expensive veteran and the team opts for replacing that with a cheap alternative. Was their usage earned or was it inherited? Maybe there was an injury that happened that the player did really well, but once the starter comes back, they're going to go right into the roles. This is not a great example, but you think of like a Fred Warner and a Tatum Bethune in the linebacker core in San Francisco. Tatum, I think he was admirable, right, in replacing. But once Fred Warner comes back, you know that Fred Warner is going to get his role, right? Like there's just some or I'm trying to think. There's probably a better player. I'm thinking like a running back or so. Like maybe Kamani Vidal would probably be better, right? Vidal came in, was very productive for the Chargers, and then all of a sudden, Marion Hampton came back and Vidal kind of vanished.
Yeah, he really did. Well, I mean, look, Vidal was an absolute afterthought heading in to this upcoming season. I had high hopes for him. When he was a rookie, had taken him, but then really the Chargers decided to go elsewhere. I mean, they bring in Marion Hampton and sign Najee Harris. Vidal was an afterthought, the third RB3 heading into the season, but then man, did he really was able to perform once he did inherit that opportunity to start with those injuries ahead of him.
And I think too, like right now we're in coach season, and I think a lot of times thinking about, with the role is the role security. I mean, a lot of that is up for grabs when you're we talk about all the time when the new front office comes in and that regime comes in. If they didn't draft, if they weren't part of your draft, they weren't part of your free agency acquisition, like your role is not protected. You've got to learn a new playbook. You got to learn a new scheme, and you got to make a way for yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if there's change in GM, change in coaching staff, you definitely do because the people that get drafted by a GM or a coach, there's a vision for the player, there's a vision for the roster, and ultimately you got to show them that you can fit, or maybe you're not a perfect fit, but you're going to put in the effort to do whatever it takes to be a spot on that team.
I mean, think about it. I mean, it's like the difference. I'm trying to think of a player that was in the same draft class. Maybe you'll be able to help me. But it's the difference between a Devon Achane and, another running back in the draft class. I can't remember off the top of my head. But, you got a new general manager now in Miami. You've got a new head coach with Jeff Hafley coming in. And Achane has been very successful in the Mike McDaniel system. A very specific system, as we've seen time and time again, running backs have been so productive. But now it's like, okay, is his role? I mean, like, okay, people might laugh us off the stage here, but is his role really protected? He's in the final year of his contract, and depending on who they bring in as an offensive coordinator, they've got Ollie Gordon, they've got Jalen Wright on the roster, then Devon Achane's a free agent. Like if you're expecting Devon Achane just to be who he was the past 3 years, I think you got to have a little bit of pause there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and obviously if you checked out my article on the Miami Dolphins and our surprise player was Devon Achane, I believe there is a chance that his role definitely isn't solidified on the team. And ultimately this is what, when a player's on the final year of his contract, it's like Devon Achane's played really well. And either does this Dolphins regime want to pay him in order to keep him on the roster, or would they rather, if they don't plan on paying him, is it worth trying to trade him away right now and get something for him versus just letting him hit free agency and ultimately not getting him back, and then the Dolphins ultimately get nothing? Where I think sometimes it's better for these GMs to be proactive, trade them knowing that you're not going to sign them, and at least get something for the asset.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, I don't, there are not really any players I would say that really fit the bill to really compare. I mean, you've got guys like, unfortunately, like a Zach Charbonnet, he tore his ACL, so he's not really good. And obviously, you'd want Jahmyr Gibbs or Bijan Robinson. Unfortunately, there's not really a lot of good running backs to compare Achane to in his draft class. But, you get the idea, this idea that it's like, okay, with this new regime coming in, he could very well just continue off where he was left off with the McDaniel staff. But I think you at least have to raise the question. I don't, and then if you're not, I think you're making a mistake.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you definitely have to raise the question. And if you're playing in a Dynasty salary cap league and you have Devon Achane and, you got to come up with a decision whether you want to, extend him or keep him on your roster. I mean, it's definitely something you got to think twice about because depending on what happens, that his situation could really change if the Dolphins do in fact trade him, which, despite how good he is, like he was a perfect fit for what McDaniel wanted to do. He fit that system. He was a similar home run hitter to a guy like Raheem Mostert, who McDaniel had a lot of familiarity with. So if this new regime coming in doesn't have that same running style or has a new vision and they don't want to pay him, Achane could definitely be on the move.
He really could, and honestly, it naturally sets up well in the next, kind of pillar that we're talking about here, which is replacement level. How hard is this role to fill, and what is the scarcity or perceived scarcity within the position? Running backs are dime a dozen. Like, okay, if you think this is crazy, I'm going to tell you, you should think otherwise. The Dolphins could draft a running back in the draft. It's not a great running back class, so they probably won't. But, think about, and we might talk about this later, but I mean, time and time again, you can look at a player like when Kenneth Walker was drafted by the Seahawks. Oh, man, Walker's going to be fantastic. And then, wait, what? Zach Charbonnet? What? Why was Zach, Zach Charbonnet, I think, was drafted in the second round. It was like, wow, why are the Seahawks using such high draft capital for Zach Charbonnet when they already drafted Kenneth Walker? So it's like, at the end of the day, you think about the running back position, it's very easy to replace versus like an edge rusher, right? Like, how hard is it to replace a Myles Garrett? How hard is it to replace a Josh Allen, right? Like some players are very, very difficult to replace. So you're like, okay, these guys are mainstays. I'm not necessarily worried about them being replaced, but depending on the role and the position and how long they've played for, just their experience, they could very much be replaceable.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's tough because running backs are a tough one in contract leagues. It's just what to do with them because they're also the most injured position. And so teams load up on them and they like to have multiple guys, which can kind of be scary in terms of, evaluating their role on the team. And, or do you have to worry about the backups end up supplanting them? Can make those things risky, but in fantasy, there's typically a scarcity at the running back position as well. So sometimes you just got to kind of take some flyer on these guys.
I honestly think, I'll be curious what you think about this. I think this is the biggest disconnect for those who play in Dynasty and how they monitor and project with what's going to happen in the NFL. I think we are oftentimes just absolutely blindsided by why NFL teams do what they do with their personnel. And every offseason, we're like scratching our heads. Now, maybe it's just they're dumb moves, right? There are just some bad franchises out there who make bad moves and they're like, you got your head scratching, being like, what are they doing? But there's also things that you just don't expect to happen, and you're completely thrown for a loop. I mean, I think about even when the Bills trade Stephon Diggs. I mean, sure, there might have been breadcrumbs that may have happened, but that was like, wow, I would not going to Houston like that. That was not expected, a few years back. So it's like there are just some things we can anticipate and plan as much as we can, but at the end of the day, NFL teams do what they want, and we have to adjust. They're not the ones to adjust. They're the ones making the decision.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, unfortunately, we do have to be, it's tough because you have to kind of be proactive, but it can only kind of be reactionary as well to what actually is going on in the actual NFL. It's interesting. And I think people are kind of surprised and, they kind of just, your Stephon Diggs example, like they're just looking at his overall production. And if they're, you're playing fantasy, you're like, man, why would the Bills do that? Like, he's performed really well on my fantasy team, been heavily involved, but don't look at the fact that he's just, it was rumored to have be absolute cancer in the locker room as he's been on other teams like the Minnesota Vikings. And ultimately the Bills decide to move on from Stephon Diggs. And then also that led to a change in their offense where they've got the everybody eats mentality. They don't have a top wide receiver. And yet the Bills still are scoring a bunch of points on offense, with Josh Allen just spreading the ball around and focusing more on the run game.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you said that really well because at the end of the day, we fixate on production. And it explains what already happened. We can account for that. What the NFL contract illuminates for us is it shapes the role security and the leverage of the team and what they decide to do. But the big piece that we then as Dynasty salary cap managers have to think about is your Dynasty contract with that player determines how expensive it is if your projection misses. And so if you're like, oh yeah, Diggs is going to be with Allen for the next 3-4 years. He's a top 10 Dynasty receiver. Like, this is a slam dunk. Well, wait, what? Or look at like a Brian Thomas Jr. Oh, he's a lock in top 10 dynasty wide receiver. Oh, now that Liam Cohen's coming in, he's going to be great. Now, who knows? I mean, it could be a wrist that was bothering him, or he could just not be a fit for his system.
Yeah. Yeah, he's an interesting one. I generally think the wrist affected his play in his production, but you got to wonder how, the fact that we still really haven't seen him put up great fantasy numbers with Trevor Lawrence. And I don't know if it's really a systematic thing or just him and Trevor Lawrence just aren't on the same page. But it's just interesting because you see a guy like Jacoby Myers get thrown in there in the middle of the season and they've got an instant rapport. And it's like, why can't he develop that with Brian Thomas Jr.?
Well, and the fourth pillar is optionality. What options does this contract create? Can you pivot if things change? That's, again, where from a dynasty perspective, if you're not in the weeds of the contracts, and that's what it helps when you're in dynasty salary cap leagues because you actually pay attention to these things. But once you look into the details and the team has the ability to get out of the contract, it changes things. I mean, you don't expect it, but there are cap casualties that happen all the time that we're like, that the average fan, I'll say, if you're not really into it, could be blindsided.
Yeah, definitely. There's surprise veteran cuts all the time, and like you said, cap casualties. And it doesn't always have to do with like the player's production or what the organization thinks about the player. It just ultimately fits better in their cap situation, makes the cap table better, and that's really how business GMs run their teams like a business. The NFL is a business, and sometimes it really doesn't matter production or what have you that we focus on. And it's really just, do we need this? Is this player worth what we're paying him, or can we get rid of him and replace it at a cheaper rate and being able to free up and have the flexibility to spend the money elsewhere?
Well, we've been following dynasty salary cap, NFL front office stuff for a long time. And what I've noticed is anytime all veteran contracts, basically, the guaranteed's all front loaded. And in the back end, they've got that optionality to get out of the contract. Almost every single one, other than maybe Deshaun Watson. He was maybe the only one that wasn't the case. And I think teams have learned from that mistake. But, it's very rare. And I think this is very important to consider. It's very rare that you're going to see a veteran player play out the duration of his contract and, end up retiring with the team and it's serving the entire contract. Usually they don't make it all that.
Yeah, no, they don't always make it that far, and it's becoming more increasingly rare to see a guy, even play for one organization, and that's not even just in the NFL; it's across a lot of sports. But yeah, I mean, the one thing I think it is a smart move, and what the NFL GMs are doing as far as, trying to push the guaranteed money down to future years, because what do we keep seeing? The NFL salary cap, the NFL is, keeps increasing every year, so the salary cap overall increases every year. So it makes sense to put the expensive numbers later and kind of deal with it later as the salary cap continues to increase and provide you the flexibility to get the best players on your roster in the current year.
So taking those four pillars there and trying to apply that from a dynasty perspective, I think really there has to be a shift. I think a lot of times we think about the questions that we ask ourselves was the player good last year? How many points did he score? What was their rank? And I'm not saying you throw that out completely, but what we would suggest is these new questions you should be asking, especially in a dynasty salary cap league, but it would be helpful in a dynasty as well, is what does this contract lock me into? How fragile are these roster spots if the role changes? What happens if performance dips before I can exit? And that's where when you apply that to dynasty and you think about dynasty salary cap, the real question is, what decision does the NFL contract force, and how does my dynasty deal amplify that risk?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, heck, place where I feel like I got burned was when I went ahead and in our league free agency, go ahead and spend all the money on Devondre Campbell, and that was coming off of his best year with the Green Bay Packers. He gets the bag by the Green Bay Packers, which gives me the confidence to go ahead and spend all this money in free agency, thinking he had his breakout year with the Packers, his production will just continue. And then come to find out, I'm left with a depreciating asset at linebacker because he sucked after that year. And then ultimately, I didn't have any exit plans and had to bite the bullet and eat a bunch of dead cap just to move on from him.
No, that's a good point. I mean, you think about, honestly, you look at like these high priced veterans, you look at guys like Tyreek Hill and Stephon Diggs, their cap hits are really high next year. And, we talked in your Dolphins article, you talked about how we fully expect Tyreek Hill to be released. He's not going to be with the team. It's just based on his cap hit and how much money they can save. Now, you would say to yourself, Tyreek Hill, before obviously his injury too, but even without his injury, I think Miami probably was going to cut him. If McDaniel was no longer going to be on the roster, I think they would have really considered moving away from him anyways. So it's like when you take that into consideration, it's like, these players are going to continue to be good, but at some point the cliff hits. That's the tough part. As usually with elite players, you're paying them a ton of money, you're paying them top dollar. But the risk is once the cliff hits, if you have a bad contract that you gave them in a dynasty salary cap league, you're on the hook. I mean, time and time again, we've seen, Andrew, who's been on the podcast before, he signed Shaquille Leonard to a massive deal. And all of a sudden, Shaquille Leonard fell off the cliff. I mean, but there are multiple examples that we could come up with that, you were like, oh, wow, yeah, this player's in their prime. They're doing great. I'm going to pay him all this money. And then it's like, oh, wow, like I made a mistake.
Yeah. Why does it always seem like it's happening to the linebacker position? Maybe with like a guy like Devondre Campbell. You mentioned Shaq Leonard with Andrew. You even with Devin White until he had the resurgence with the Las Vegas Raiders this past year. But man, the linebacker position has been absolutely killing us.
It really is. It has been brutal. But I mean, there are other positions too. I'm trying to remember. But we've seen, even some receivers. I mean, look at a Brandon Ayuk. He's not even old, right? He's the type of player that you would say is kind of in that safe mid tier. He got a big contract. You think about even guys like Kirk Cousins, Chris Godwin, those players who, they got these good contracts. We expect them to be a huge part of these offenses. And Kirk Cousins got benched. Chris Godwin, they ended up drafting Emeka Ibuka. It's like, wait, what? Godwin's supposed to be back. He's rehabilitated. He's with Mike Evans. He before he got injured, he was the wide receiver 1. I mean, he was absolutely elite. No one was expecting. That was a shocker when they drafted Emeka Ibuka. So now if you had Chris Godwin, you signed this huge contract, it's like, well, now he didn't come back. His ankle's kind of, and then you got Brandon Ayuk, a guy who, who knows what's going to happen with him. I mean, I would think he's going to land on his feet and just not play for San Francisco. But, it's like if you have too many of those safe mid players, you could get burned because at the end of the day, they may not end up being that safe. And who knows what your ceiling is because you don't have these elite guys.
Yeah. That's the thing. I feel like you got to be careful with the safe mid-tier players because you feel like they're providing you the safety, but they typically don't have the upside in the ceiling that, other guys necessarily will provide. And, interesting with Kirk Cousins, just like too, I could totally see somebody having the full confidence. Atlanta pays them all that money. And then, right before your eyes, they draft Michael Penix and you're like, what in the heck? Everyone's like, what in the heck is the Atlanta Falcons doing? Like, you paid Kirk Cousins to be your starter. Now, what message are you sending to Kirk Cousins? Now you're going with Michael Penix. And if you're ultimately paying Kirk Cousins thinking you've got the, nice, safe option at quarterback, well, now it's not safe. You got a lot of risk because now they just drafted a rookie and do they have more faith in him moving forward than, older Kirk Cousins who we hadn't seen coming off of an Achilles injury.
Well, and I think even too, you mentioned rookies like with Michael Penix. It's like I think a lot of times in Dynasty, one of the other traps when it comes to, I guess maybe being too bullish about your roster is like, oh, well, everyone wants, the rookies. They want the young players. And it's like, oh, if I have them, then, I'm going to try to get as young as possible and I can be in an elite state. But we even were talking about on our last episode, talking about Travion Henderson, a guy who, is he a cornerstone player or is he going to be a disappointment? And it's like, okay, well, yes, he was a 2nd round pick, but he's a change of pace back, and Andre's not going anywhere. If you look at his contract, and even if he is, who says they don't replace him? And Henderson is never given that full opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, it is a chance that they don't ever give, Travion Henderson the full opportunity because I do kind of believe, based on the history of Josh McDaniels with the Patriots, they've always had multiple backs. The best thing I was saying in the draft process that you're hoping was Travion Henderson could kind of be that James White type player. Then his third down blocking doesn't end up happening as good as everyone thought coming out of the pre-draft process. They said he was the best pass blocker. Mike Vrabel and the Patriots couldn't rely on that. Ramondre Stevenson's out there for way more third downs. He's also getting the work in the receiving game, which was just a total letdown and not what anyone was expecting. So yeah, I think Henderson is a tough one. He's got a ton of upside. See him hit the home runs. It's just, will he ever get the opportunities that he really, everyone was expecting and people think he deserves?
Well, let's give you another one that would be even more of a conundrum. What about a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs? Gibbs is an elite running back, and anybody and everybody would want him. But, he's kind of had to rotate in that role with David Montgomery. But David Montgomery, there's a possibility he's not back on the roster. Now, for Lions, I'm not saying Lions fans, but for Jahmyr Gibbs, people who have Jahmyr Gibbs, they're hoping, they're crossing their fingers thinking, man, Gibbs is going to be the standalone back. He's going to get a ton of volume. He's going to be a league winner next year. He's going to just go off. It's not going to necessarily stop the Lions from signing a running back in free agency or drafting one. And then people are going to be, and I wouldn't be shocked, and they would be pulling their hair because they're like, thought this was it. This was Gibbs' pathway. Now that one's even more complicated because now you've got to pay Gibbs, especially in that Dynasty salary cap league. You've got to pay him top dollar. In our league, you're probably giving him like, 30 plus million, right? With a ton of guaranteed probably too. And so it's like, yes, I feel confident in Gibbs, or even like a Bijan Robinson with Tyler Algier as a free agent. Is it going to be Bijan Robinson, or are they going to bring in another running back? And now it's not going to be. That's where people have been frustrated. I think that's the thing you got to consider, with these safe players, or not safe, but these rookie players that feel safe, I should say.
Yeah, I think I have more confidence with Jahmyr Gibbs just because even this past year we saw David Montgomery not get as much work as we had been accustomed to, and Dan Campbell was even coming out and saying, we get David Montgomery more touches. Well, more touches never really came for David Montgomery, and it really was the Jahmyr Gibbs show. So I definitely think, look, you'd be kind of naive to think that the Lions aren't going to bring in somebody, whether it is bringing David Montgomery back. I know Dan Campbell absolutely loves that guy, but if they don't, it'll be somebody else. But I still would expect Jahmyr Gibbs to get the lion's share. Where it'll be interesting is kind of with the Falcons, but this, even despite all the work that Tyler Algier was getting, I mean, Bijan Robinson was still one of the elite and top backs for fantasy.
Oh, he definitely was. But considering all this, right, we wanted to talk about some of the common dynasty mistakes that front offices avoid. I think one of the biggest ones, and you hear about this all the time in free agency, is not paying for the name value. People have that name and they decide to lock in and they pay a ton of money. I remember early on in our Dynasty salary cap league, Dalvin Cook, I don't know if you remember this, was a free agent.
Of course I did.
And one of the managers paid something crazy. Like, what was it? Like almost like 50 or 60 million. And that was like almost like a fifth of their cap. And it was like, what are you doing? Like, that's just way too much. But
it might have been more than that.
Might have been more. I don't know. It was high. And it was like, what are we doing here with Dalvin Cook? I mean, like, I know he's a name, but you got to be careful chasing after that name value.
Well, why I remember it so vividly is I was in the mix of chasing that name value right with the other owner, which I want to say, ultimately, I think he might have gotten into the 70s because it was at some point I was just like, look, this is just getting way out of hand. I was in it for a while, but then I think it approached the 70s and I'm just like, all right, I just can't do this. Like, enough is enough. But I think that's also part of the scarcity of the running back position, that not only you're changing the name value, but there's so many teams in our league, and then there's so few running backs that you just feel desperate and you almost feel like you have to do a bold move like that just to get a decent one on your roster.
Travis Kelce was another one. I don't know if you remember, I let him hit the market. And this will be another topic we talk about is, when to let players go and when to know when to let them go. But I'm glad I did because they paid like over 70 per year for him. And that year where I let him go, he didn't come back to that number. He's just been declining ever since then. And so they chase after the name and it didn't do him any favors.
Yeah, again, I mean, tight end, one of those positions like running back. I mean, there's so few tight ends out there. And then you see Travis Kelce on the block and just think about the cheat code that he could be at tight end, because there is such a scarcity and there is like not many elite tight ends, and he's one of them. And if you get an elite tight end, you know that's such a difference maker, especially we have tight end premium as well. So you're really putting emphasis on that, and it's so hard to resist that temptation to go ahead and add him. And I think, heck, I mean, I think you kind of got caught with that this past offseason when you went ahead and signed Chris Jones as well.
Oh yeah, that was bad. That was really bad. And kudos to John, who, in our league, who decided to let him go. And again, what we're talking about, when to know when to let somebody hit the market. And that was great decision making on his part.
Yeah, because I mean, you also picked up some younger, less known names at the defensive tackle, but interesting. And I feel like they outperformed, Chris Jones. And from especially, you didn't have to pay too much for Chris Jones, and like the name value wasn't there, but you still had to pay more than some of those other no namers and didn't quite get that production back that you had to spend.
Yeah, I agree, and I think another dynasty mistake that front office avoid. I think this is a biggie. We already alluded to it some, but confusing talent with leverage. We think that because the player is so talented, from what we can tell, that they have this leverage that's like, okay, like no way their role should be questioned. But we use the examples of the Kenneth Walker and the Zach Charbonnet. It's like, wait, what's going on here, right? You've got the Kirk Cousins and the Michael Penix. There are, even think about like a Colston Loveland, right? I mean, Cole Kmet was not anybody crazy good, but it's like now that Colston Loveland's there, it's like, okay, Cole Kmet, you're pushed to the side here.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, that is interesting. Just how guys' roles can, they perform well. It looks like their role's going to be good, and then something changes like that, and then there's somebody else that people like better. But I think also, I mean, that was in Colston Loveland versus Cole Kmet was also another one of those coaching change situations where even though Cole Kmet had shown some productive years, obviously the Bears liked what they saw in Loveland. They took him very high in the draft, and you saw how well he ended up fitting as he closed out the season.
Or even look at like a team like the Cincinnati Bengals, right? With having T. Higgins and then drafting Jamar Chase. I mean, you thought that, T. Higgins could have been a capable wide receiver one, and then they go ahead and draft Chase. And, Higgins is still very relevant, but he's no Jamar Chase. I mean, teams do it all the time. We think that it's like, oh, well, like this player is so talented. There's no way that they're going to, draft at that position. And they do it time and time again, or they add a free agent. And it's like, would have never saw that coming.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I guess you can never be quite set. And I don't think NFL GMs look at it as like, I don't think they're ever kind of resting on their laurels that think they're set at a position. I think, you talk about the good coaches, talk about like healthy competition and bringing other players in. And then as far as the depth chart, those bottom tier players ended up pushing the top ones. And I think if you have, two really good wide receivers, they only push each other and can kind of make each other better as well. But you're not wrong. I think T. Higgins has what it takes to be a wide receiver one on many other teams.
And that's why, honestly, and this will be a different topic for a different day, but that's where I typically like to draft in the rookie drafts. I like to go best player available, just like a lot of NFL front offices do, because at the end of the day, you could draft based off of need. And this happens way too much, especially at a scarce position like the running back position. Like we saw, like people reaching like absolutely crazy. It's like, okay. And remember, in our league, it's IDP and offense, but you could have had safety Xavier Watts, or you could have had, Bill, right? Like Bill Krosky-Merritt. People were so excited about Bill Krosky-Merritt. It's like, if the Commanders end up drafting, who knows? Maybe they draft Jeremiah Love in the first round. It's like, okay, well, goodbye, Bill Krosky-Merritt managers. Like, your value just absolutely cratered out on you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and just look at what happened on the roster too. I mean, I think people are excited because, they end up getting rid of shipping Brian Robinson out of town. If you have Bill, you're like thinking, oh, that's even better. But then it's like, then he's competing with Chris Rodriguez Jr., who a guy that was going to, previous season couldn't really get a spot. He was on the practice squad quite a bit, but plays really well and kind of earned that role over Bill Krosky-Merritt. But yeah, I mean, that was a good point. I mean, that we saw in our rookie draft quite a few of those reaches just based on whether they want to go offense or just they needed a certain position, and ultimately led to, a guy like Xavier Watts, very talented, but ends up dropping just because people didn't prioritize the safety position.
Well, I think another dynasty mistake that I think you and I have both struggled with, honestly, but is overcommitting to one window. I mean, we see it like you and I are like, we're going to push all our chips in to try to get in to get this championship. And then when we whiff, it's like, oh boy, got to go back to the workbench here and start to build the team back up again.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I guess I don't mind overcommitting to trying to win because I'd rather, I don't know, I still would almost want to
But look at
do,
the sacrifice, though, in some ways, because you were going for it for like 2 years, and now or 3 years, and you've now had to rebuild, and you're still in the midst of the rebuild. Like you're probably not back at that high level of competition for probably another 2 years, at least.
yeah, sure, but I'm okay with that because once that window's open, I think you got to take advantage of it. And I don't
Hmm.
necessarily regret being that aggressive because I'd rather just, to me, I'd almost like there's the fact of having no in between. I don't really care to have a competitive team that just makes the playoffs. If I make the playoffs, I want to win. I want to either have a chance, like you said, I'd rather be all in trying to win than just rest on my laurels and be like, it's good that I'm, middle of the pack team, but I don't want to be a middle of the pack team. I either want to be competing or in the rebuild mode that I'm currently in, and don't be afraid to rebuild it. It's a, I feel like it's a fun time trying to build build the things from the ground up and really try to get back to that competing window.
I mean, a lot of people have a hard. I mean, I think it varies. I think there's some people who really love rebuilding and find it fun. Other people are like, if I'm not competitive, I check out.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
no,
and that's
no,
why you get orphan leagues in dynasty formats, right? When you don't have a dynasty salary cap, and that salary cap helps to regulate player movement, you have people being like, "I'm so far behind, I'm out."
yeah. Well, and I think that's a good point too. Just like, as far as last year, not that I was checked out, but I didn't necessarily care as much. I didn't have a ton of cap space. My roster was pretty bare bones, but what I had was a glimmer of hope to look forward to was just get past that season because now this year my cap space is wide open and now I can have more fun this year. So last year was a tough one to swallow and not be as competitive as I want, but now I've got the opportunity to go ahead and compete for some free agents and really try to make my team better to get closer to being able to compete again.
Well, and kind of to the before what we were talking about, it really does depend on your risk tolerance, right? Because depending on your dynasty, the deal that you have in dynasty and how you structured it, you could have a far greater risk. There's nothing wrong with that. It just really depends on your risk, and you could get burned. And I think that's where ignoring exit timing, which is our last dynasty mistake, that one's a tough one because you just don't see the cliff coming and then it's there. And so it's like I do think you need to bake in the exit because if you don't, like I have got an albatross of a contract. Sure, Devin White, kind of, revived his career. But before that, I'm like, oh my goodness, I have an albatross of a contract and I can't get out from underneath it.
Yeah, definitely. You definitely always want to have a plan for exit, and whether it's just like an individual player's contract or just like a team strategy. But, in terms of looking at how you're structuring a contract, typically you'll see, if you're looking at a spot track or something, you'll see that even on the NFL contracts, they say potential out and what the ramifications are if they do post cut, pre June 1st cut. And you kind of also want to give yourself one of those out options. Maybe it's, in a 3-year deal or a 4-year deal. Maybe it's after the third year, give yourself a little bit of a window, try to get rid of the guaranteed money as fast as possible. So your contract is more favorable later.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, and I do this a lot. People get scared. Well, again, this is, we've been talking about a lot of different topics that we look forward to cover throughout the year here. One of the things is when it comes to dead cap, and you mentioned it about having a lot of signing bonus in our league and then having that dead cap. I almost kind of view that as somewhat of an advantage. And I know people be like, why would you think that is an advantage? You're going to have more dead cap. Yes, but you can use that as a bargaining chip because then it's kind of in a way, not ignoring that exit timing, but you can get out from underneath that. Yes, I'm going to take on this dead cap, but then I can get rid of this contract from this player that I don't think is going to be around much longer. I think you can use that as a leverage point.
Yeah, that is a good point too. And then, because I mean, not only that, you can also be like, as far as what you're getting in return for the player, you could be like, look, I have to eat this much dead cap. Now, since I have to eat all that dead cap, you're getting a favorable contract in return. So I think you should give me a better trade package or a better pick in return, just because I'm having to eat a lot of dead cap. And it really is more advantageous for the contract is way more advantageous for you to take it on than for me to, as it currently sits.
If there's one thing to take from this episode, it's this. Don't try to predict the future. Project upside, but don't build your roster so it only works if you're right. I mean, unless you're Joe, but then you'll take the risk. And if you're really bad for a long time, then you'll be really bad. But we'd recommend pick one contract on your roster and ask, we think, a better question. What options does this deal actually give me if things change? Because like we talked about, there's a variety of situations as to why their situation could change. And then you got to be able to shift. And that shift alone will help change how you build your team. Next episode, we're diving into why most dynasty windows are lost in the offseason, not during the season itself. You're going to want to check that out. And this is a new adventure for us over at Front Office Pros. We're going to be doing this podcast once a week throughout the year. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you're downloading it. So once we drop it on Thursdays, you can tune in, and please give us 5 stars and a comment showing your support. We would greatly appreciate it. We'll see you next time.